Ja. Mein Glas,
Okay, verstehe. Da kann man nicht dziękuję, że pani wydrukować, znaczy jeszcze mówiąc, tylko tak mi się tekst przysłałam. Ja wiem, że co się wydarzyło, ale mam swoje dziękuję.
Sehr gerne. Gut, aber wir können beginnen. Das ist eben die berühmte polnische Pünktlichkeit, also 10 Minuten später. Ja, aber ich müsste Sie ganz beherzigen, weil diejenigen, die heute zu uns gekommen sind, die sitzen hier im Konferenzraum, als auch ca. 40 Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer, die vor ihrem Computer sitzen und uns online begleiten. Ich freue mich, dass wir heute solche prominente Gäste auf dem Podium haben. Der Professor Thomas Getschkens aus Los Angeles. Er ist zu uns gekommen, naja, indirektweise, würde ich aber sagen. Er ist momentan hier in Berlin an der Freien Universität. Er war angesiedelt hier ein Jahr, 2 Semester insgesamt, oder?
Nein,
Ja, du was heißt Jahre, aber alles. Und für unsere liebe Kollegin aus Warschau, aber auch teilweise aus Bern, die zu uns heute gekommen ist Frau Dr. Johanna Wessenhaus. Ich freue mich, dass wir diese Reihe, Klaus Zernack und drei Vorlesungen erkennen, das ist schon das 2. Mal, als wir uns in diesem Zyklus, in diesem Jahr betreffen. Und bevor wir zum heutigen Thema kommen werden, möchte ich gerne Ihnen noch unsere letzte Publikation zeigen, für die wir polnischsprachig sind. Also insgesamt das Zentrum veröffentlicht 4 Publikationsreihen. Also die erste Reihe, wir sind ganz stolz darauf, die heißt Fokus und erscheint beim Brill, und in den nächsten 2 Monaten ein Sammelband aus unserem kunsthistorischen Konferenz, die wir im letzten Jahr organisiert haben, wird erscheinen von Milena Woźniak-Koch herausgegeben. Die zweite heißt Polen in Europa, und wir werden auch 3 dicke Bände in diesem Jahr zu erscheinen. Und die dritte heißt auf Polnisch Przełomy ludzie dialogu, auf Deutsch Wendepunkte und Persönlichkeiten des deutsch-polnischen Dialogs, und ist dem Thema polnisch-deutsche Aussöhnung im 20. Jahrhundert gewidmet. Und wir haben vor ein paar Wochen einen neuen Band veröffentlicht. Da sind auf Polnisch, das sind die Erinnerungen von Markus Meckel. Markus Meckel, eine sehr wichtige Gestalt in der DDR-Geschichte. Und der letzte Außenminister der demokratischen Regierung in der DDR, und jetzt haben wir seine Erinnerungen ins Polnische übersetzt. Also ich lasse das Buch jetzt hier im Saal zu zirkulieren, wollte. Das ist keine Konkurrenz für Sie. Und damit gebe ich das Wort an meine liebe Kollegin Milena Woźniak-Koch. Sie wird das Ganze heute moderieren. Bitte, du hast das Wort.
Vielen lieben Dank, liebe so now I'm also switching to English. Es tut mir leid, ich würde sehr gerne das auch auf Deutsch machen, aber von Sprache von Wolfgang Goethe, jetzt gehen wir machen wir switch ins Shakespeare's language. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Berlin, to the second seminar of the Klaus Zernack Colloquium series entitled Museums, Collections, and the Art Market, Enhanced Perspectives. My name is Milena Woźniak-Koch, and I'll have the pleasure of moderating today's evening. It's also my great pleasure and honor to welcome our distinguished speakers. First, the main speaker, Dr. Joanna Smalcerz, who is an assistant professor at the University of Warsaw and associated professor at the University of Bern, who will present her lecture today. And the great honor to welcome the great German art historian and pioneer of research in the field of history and biography and the influence of Wilhelm Bode, Herr Professor Thomas Gettgens. So it's a great pleasure of having you here this evening. So shortly about our excellent speakers. If I may, I start with Joanna. She received her PhD from the University of Bern in 2017. She works on the history of the Italian art market and collecting in the late 19th century, the reception of the Italian Renaissance art and the intersection of art historical scholarship and the 19th century politics of cultural patrimony. She worked on the project for the study of collecting and provenance at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles and was research assistant and lecturer at the University of Bern in Switzerland, as well as visiting lecturer at the University of Basel, also in Switzerland. She is the author of the excellent book, Smuggling the Renaissance, the illicit export of artworks out of Italy, 1861-1909, published in Brill in 2020. Her awards include fellowships from the Biblioteca Hertziana, Max Planck Institute for Art History in Rome, and the Villa Tati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. She is currently assistant professor at the University of Warsaw and associated researcher at the University of Bern. So, dear Joanna, we are extremely happy having you here tonight. And the pleasure is definitely not less to introduce Professor Gettgens, who completed his PhD at the Art History Institute of the University of Bonn and his habilitation at the University of Göttingen. Between 1980 and 2006, he was a professor at the Art History of the Freie Universität Berlin. From 1997, he was a founding director of the German Forum for Art History in Paris and held his position there till 2007. And between 2007 and 2018, he was a director of the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. Since 2011, Professor Gettgens has been a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also a member of the Academy of Sciences in Göttingen. Professor Gettgens was honored with many titles. Among others, let me just briefly mention, was the Doctor Honoris Causa of the Courtauld Institute in London in 2004 and Doctor Honoris Causa of the University Paris Sorbonne in 2011. He was also awarded Grand Prix de l'Académie Française pour la Francophonie in 2009. And briefly mentioning some numerous publications of Professor Gettgens are, for example, die Berliner Museuminsel im Deutschen Kaiserreich zur Kulturpolitik der Museen in der Wilhelminischen Epoche, it was published in 1982. Also as a co-editor with Barbara Paul, Wilhelm von Bode, Mein Leben. This was a fourth volume of Quellen zur deutschen Kunstgeschichte vom Klassizismus bis zur Gegenwart. This was published in 1997, and with well-known among Polish art historian with Professor Krzysztof Pomian, Le Deuxième Siècle in 1998, and many more numerous essays on French and German art of the 18th and 20th centuries and the history of the museums. So, Professor Gettgens, we are most honored and happy having you also here. So, yes. We don't have to remind the title of the today's seminar, but let us do this. So Wilhelm von Bode, the entanglement of art historical scholarship, connoisseurship, and the art trade in the late 19th century. the topic is extremely fascinating. And I think not only because of the biographical approach and sort of a case study, which is definitely one aspect of this topic. What I find particularly fascinating is the possibility of gaining through this perspective, through the figure of Wilhelm Bode, kind of a critical overview of the formation of the canons of history of art. As well as of the critical overview of the history of art as a scholarship by itself. So this is really fascinating topic. And before we start, and before I give the floor to Joanna, please let me allow to make still some organizational remarks. So. We are going to listen to the lecture of Joanna first, and then afterwards we're gonna ask Professor Gedgens to deliver a commentary. Then afterwards, Joanna will respond to those remarks or questions, and then finally we will hand it over to the audience. And yes, we are looking forward to hearing to all the questions from the audience, which is in person, and also the audience, which is so numerous on Zoom. So please, if you have any questions, you are most welcome to type them in chat on Zoom, and we will then read them aloud. So I think that's all from my side. And as I mentioned, we are really extremely excited about the Wilhelm Bode's topic and biography. So looking forward to hearing your presentation, Joanna. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Professor Gedgens for accepting my invitation as well. I'm very honored to hear your comments later. Let us start. Wilhelm von Bode died in Berlin on the 1st of March 1929. During his memorial service, held 4 days later in the Basilica of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, a number of prominent speakers attested to Bode's accomplishments and services. Among them was Adolf Wolfenberg, representing the Association of German Trade in Art and Antiquities, Verband des Deutschen Kunst- und Antiquitätenhandels. His speeches were cited in extensive research, which I'm bringing on screen in translation. Wolfenberg. These can only be brief words of thanks, summarizing what His Excellency von Bode has been and done for the German art trade. It is thanks to him that the German art trade, placed on a sound scientific foundation, has become an important factor in the world's art trade. It is thanks to him that the German art trade opened up new areas that were of the greatest importance for its development. His Excellency von Bode has made Islamic and East Asian art museum worthy and a widespread field of collecting. He has widely spread the understanding and enjoyment of Dutch 17th century painting and early Italian art, and thus educated a generation of collectors, all of which had had an extremely fruitful effect on the German art trade and given it an unexpected boom. In this context, I would like to point out Bode's founding of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum Association. And now, still Wolfenberg, and now regarding his personal relationship with the art trade, not only to every collector, but also to every art dealer, the greatest and the smallest. His Excellency von Bode was always ready with advice and action, untiring in his willingness to share his truly universal knowledge and universal spirit. The German art trade has also had the satisfaction of thanking His Excellency von Bode during his lifetime through constant collaboration in his life's work, the development of German museums and thus of German collectors. This is how an exemplary and beneficial interrelationship between the museum and the art trade came into being, exemplary and indispensable for the future as well. That was in 1929. But a representative of the Association of German Trade in Art and Antiquities, so honored the late General Director of the Berlin Museums, is a telling sign of Bode's exceptional relationship with the art trade. Wolfenberg touched on a number of issues that were emblematic for Bode's involvement in and impact on the art market, such as the foundation and propagation of new areas of collecting, a contribution to the development of private collecting in German-speaking Europe, and the strategic cooperation of scholars and the museum world with art dealers. Wilhelm van Bode's complex relationship with the art market, the rise of connoisseurship, and its tight intertwinement with the art trade lie at the core of my recent edited volume, Wilhelm van Bode and the Art Market, Connoisseurship, Networking and Control of the Marketplace, which seeks to introduce new material and a different perspective on Bode's activity in the Western art market of his day. My introduction to the volume served as the basis for this talk today. Bode's vigorous activity in the realm of the art market illustrates most of the trends and dynamics that characterized the Western art marketplace during the last 4 decades of the 19th and the first two of the 20th century. Between about 1860 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Europe and North America underwent epochal political, economic, and social transformation that brought about the social and institutional systems of modernity, also giving rise to a new art marketplace, unique in its framework and in terms of the constellation and numbers of actors populating it. This marketplace was further transformed by the entry of expansive national museums, the professionalization of art history, which furnished it with art scholars and connoisseurs, the impoverishing aristocracy inclined to sell their art collections, the ascending bourgeoisie with big spending power, and finally, the rise and internationalization of dealers' galleries. These structural changes solidified relatively young or novel forms of art conception, for instance, the building of collections from scratch, focused on masterpieces, and created trends that were as such and in their extent unique to that particular era. And I mean mostly large-scale acquisition campaigns by European museums, such as the South Kensington Museum, the Louvre, that was first, and the Berlin World Museums that joined this competition as the last big European institution. And the unprecedented influx of substantial private new wealth, the flow of new art scholarship, and newly emerging artworks expanding the herbs of old masters. This all created that very particular, more or less 50 years of that created the art market as we know it now. It was in this rapidly evolving art world that Bode was appointed as assistant in the Department of Sculpture at the Berlin Royal Museums in 1872, quickly rising to prominence in the institutional hierarchy as director of the Department of Sculpture in 1883, director of Picture Gallery in 1890, and eventually the general director of Berlin Royal Museums in 1905. As a museum official, he was a member of the Prussian-German imperial machinery of cultural policy, at a time when the profession of the art historian was born out of cultural nationalisms and the nationalization of the histories of art. This situation made of Bode an actor who ultimately channeled the agency stemming from the German apparatus of Kulturpolitik and its founding, driven by the unified state's cultural aspirations, into the dynamics of the international art market. It was through Bode that much of the European new money flowed into the art market, coming either from the German Empire itself when he was buying for the museums, not just Berlin museums, for various German museums, prominently Strasbourg, or from the German-speaking newly rich tycoons of the so-called Gründerzeit, when he was purchasing for the wide web of his private collector at museums. As Michael J. Reeves showed in his essay on Bode's purchases of Dutch paintings in England in the volume, in the eyes of the London dealers, for instance, Bode quickly came to embody the market force represented by Berlin, a perception that did not fade even at the time of Berlin's financial decline after the First World War. Through his position, Bode emerges as one of the most important mediators in the unprecedented and multi-directional transfer of art objects and artifacts, mostly old master painting and sculpture, but also, for example, as we know, Oriental rugs, throughout late 19th century Europe, from dissolving big private collections to public museum collections, and at the same time through his advisory to private collectors, from public religious spaces to newly established private collections. All of these transfers contributed to a pronounced geographical redistribution of cultural assets within Europe. For instance, many Italian Renaissance works of art that had not been brought across the Alps during the Grand Tour or the Napoleonic Wars were moved north in the last quarter of the 19th century, as exemplified by licit and illicit, these are just two examples, exportations of many works of the Italian Renaissance to Berlin, or by the transfer of many paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, including works of Rembrandt and Vermeer, from the British Isles to Central Europe, to Germany and elsewhere, or to America, as is shown in the volume in the essays by Michael J. Reeves, Kathleen B. Scullen, and Ismay Bodvar. Newly emerged art collectors of the late 19th century, whose social backgrounds and cultural literacy differed from those of past generations of aristocratic art patrons and collectors, relied on art experts to help them build their collections. The professional figure of the art expert advisor crystallized alongside the discipline of art history and the reigning positivistic paradigm of the time, and was catapulted into extraordinary importance by the international race in both the public and private sectors to build prestigious art collections. Just as the National Gallery in London employed local art experts in Italy in the first half of the 19th century, so the American collectors like prominently Isabella Stewart Gardner or Henry Waters employed Bernard Berenson towards the end of that century to act as advisor and agent, while German-speaking collectors based in Berlin, like James Seaman, or in Prague, like Adalbert von Lana, and I'm showing you all other collectors that worked with Bode, benefited from the services of Wilhelm Bode. So these two men, of course, Bode and Berenson are alone responsible for a transfer of huge numbers of works to Europe and to America. In this regard, too, Bode's activity as advisor makes him representative of the trends in the marketplace of the time. Now, tonight, my general aim is to expose the modus operandi of Bode's strategic participation in the art market, and thus to explore his complex agency within the art marketplace of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I intend to do so using the optics of two different entanglements. Firstly, by addressing the consequences of Bode's conflicting engagements within art scholarship and art marketplace, and the ways he sought to play them to his utmost advantage. That is, his direct involvement in the entanglement of art scholarship, connoisseurship, and art trade, and his contribution to this intertwinement, or indeed entanglement of these three spheres, three realms. And secondly, by expanding our knowledge on Bode's multi-layered social network to gain a fuller understanding of how he deployed his social ties to achieve his goals at the Berlin museums, and how the size of his network that permitted unexpected corners of the marketplace both exacerbated the aforementioned consequences of conflicting roles and increased his clout. I will frame Bode's use of his social network as Bode's strategy in the context of his entanglement by the goal of the expansion of the Berlin museums. So these will be two definitions of entanglement that I'm using as a theoretical framework. The approach that I suggest that is revealing of Bode's agency is to focus on Bode's multifaceted and frequently conflicting roles within the marketplace, a question that thus far has not received enough concerted attention. Bode navigated the international art market by adopting different, often contradictory professional identities. As an accomplished art historian and museum curator, he was the peer at other European curators and scholars. He was also an expert, a connoisseur, and an appraiser, as well as an advisor to numerous private collectors and to some art dealers and government officials. At the same time, however, he was himself a strategic buyer, and often a client of the same art dealers, as well as a ruthless competitor and other museum keepers, collectors, and state officials, especially in the market for old master sculpture and painting. When analyzed closely, the contradictions of these roles reveal Bode's navigation and shrewd maneuvering of the marketplace, always aimed at facilitating new acquisitions for Berlin or other museums in Germany, for Kaiserreich, and its maintainment of contacts in one way or another useful for future purchases. Such a contradiction was explored by Martin Gaia in his essay in the volume on the double game Bode played with the Italians vis-à-vis their export policies that he officially endorsed, but covertly circumvented, as was the case in the illicit export of Giovanni Bellini's resurrection to Berlin. Bode's conflicting roles within the marketplace were particularly visible in his activity in Italy. Bode's conflicts of interest peaked during the lengthy process of the acquisition by the Italian state of the Borghese art collection in Rome. In 1892, when a part of the collection was put on sale, Bode had considered the possible purchase of some of the Borghese artworks and discussed this with the dealer Stefano Bardini. 9 years later, the German curator was commissioned by the Italian government to appraise the collection before its acquisition by the state. While Bode has been demonized in the recent literature on the contamination of the 19th century canon of Italian Renaissance sculpture, I seek here to further complicate our understanding of his role by attending to the complexities of his involvement in the increasing entanglement between art historical scholarship, connoisseurship, and art market activity in the late 19th century. These issues inevitably raised the question of Bode's integrity and complicity in the conscious expansion of the art historical canon in cooperation with dealers. If we compare Bode's comments on Bernard Berenson, his arch rival as a connoisseur and scholar of Italian art, whom he openly criticized for being, apart from being a scholar, a picture dealer, as noted by Martin Gaia, with the material brought forward in the volume by Patrizia Cappellini on Bode's real reputation in Florence as an antiquarian, which means a dealer, it becomes apparent that if he was not really sort of lacking self-awareness, he was using these contradictions and was acted hypocritically. If an isolated datum cited by Detlef Heikamp in 1996 is true, Bode in fact was to receive a 12% commission from the Florentine dealer Stefano Bardini, who his main contact in Italy and main supplier of Italian art, for each work that Bardini sold to any of Bode's advancees. Now, I'd be very grateful for any information on that evidence, because none of the authors in the volume really was able to corroborate that unique fact from Heikamp's publication. If this is true, this circumstance would make Bode's approach no different to Berenson's, engaging in a similar system with Kolnagi, although it may be speculated that he would likely have directed the gains towards the Berlin museums, as opposed to Berenson, who profited privately from the money that he accrued from selling works to collectors or mediating. Even if Bode was not remunerated for his intimidation between Bardini and private collectors, his lifelong engagement with private art advisory made him a continuously active participant in the marketing strategies of dealers and turned him into a, I'd say, perpetuator of the trends and canons promoted by dealers, perhaps inadvertently, but that was the effect. As I have argued elsewhere, and I remind you of the work that introduced me actually to the work on Bode for this volume. Bode strategically cemented his position within the marketplace through the conscious accumulation of his social capital by means of an expanding social network. Each further connection advanced his standing and increased his chances of success in any given endeavor, usually aimed at an acquisition for the Berlin museums, but also at promoting his attributions and cementing his position as a respected connoisseur. As those with direct access to the art objects, dealers and art market intermediaries played a central role in the web of Bode's connections, supporting both his acquisition strategies and his scholarship. Close cooperation with art dealers gave Bode access to the works unearthed by the market and enabled him to see and study hitherto unknown objects in person or through photography. This undertaking was crucial for establishing the oeuvres of the artists and art historical narratives at the time of the consolidation of art historical canons, which Bode actively co-created, writing his connoisseurial art history. This dynamic is exposed, for instance, in Bode's Die Werke der Familie de la Robbia, published in 1914, where to build his narrative on the de la Robbia family, he relied on multiple works either still in the hands of dealers or recently sold to the collectors like Prince Adam's show in Boston or Nelly Jacquemin-André in Paris. Acquisitions inspired research and publications canonized the artworks. In his 1900 essay on Luca della Robbia, Bode himself noted that most of the recent scholarship on the della Robbia, that is, and he meant Aimé Barbara-Dujoux, Alain Marquand, and himself, had been inspired by the respective acquisitions of Bode's curators for the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum in New York through Henry Gardner Marquand, and the Berlin Museums. Studies of the late 19th century art market have successfully demonstrated the extent to which art historical canons were shaped by the dealers controlling the market supply, who sought cooperations with prominent connoisseurs to market their stock and art historical publications. In Bode's Florentina Bildhauer der Renaissance, Stefano Bardini is cited multiple times by Bode, and Bardini was the biggest provider of Donatello, for instance, of Donatello and of Florentine, generally of Florentine sculpture, to Bode. Bode's career and success relied on the business of 19th century connoisseurship, and like other art historians of the time involved in the commerce of art, he was entangled in the reciprocal dynamics and interdependencies of the nascent discipline of art history, connoisseurship, and the art trade. The dynamic of mutual benefits that underlay attribution policies is evident, for instance, in Bode's relationship with the dealer Charles Edelmeier and their transactions involving works by Rembrandt, about which Bode was a preeminent scholar. In 1890, Edelmeier offered to sponsor Bode's Rembrandt corpus, this big catalogue resume, that was later successfully published between 1897 and 1906. As was noted in her essay in the volume by Catherine Scarlett, Bode's discomfort with some of the attributions that he included in the catalogue was clear and palpable even in the language of his descriptions. He continued the deal, however, to conclude his enormous oeuvre, and his complicity in the expansion of the Rembrandt canon allowed Zedelmeier to profit by selling Bode's editions from Zedelmeier's stock as Rembrandt's, obviously. And then Bode himself was still benefiting from Zedelmeier's stock and from what Zedelmeier offered him as the first client. Some of these attributions were referred only years after the catalogue's publication. And there's a similar case with, not involving catalogue resume, but a similar case with doubtful or attributions by Bode regarding Brumaire, explored by Esme Korpe in the volume. Yet another facet of Bode's entanglement by the intertwinement of his scholarship and his involvement with the art trade and art advisory was his mission to enrich the collection of the Berlin museums with late Gothic German wood sculpture. In 1881, Bode started to study the late Gothic German wood sculpture with a view to write extensive chapters on it in his forthcoming Geschichte der deutschen Plastik that was later published in 1887. In order to get to know his works, he embarked on a mission of both touring the sites with extant artworks in southern Germany and of networking with the local dealers to gain access to further objects. His accompanying promotion of this art form among such brilliant collectors as Oskar Heinauer, Wilhelm Ruprecht, Richard von Kaufmann, James Seaman, and Gerhard Bollert, led to his search in the prices of these artworks on the German art market, but also to some extent channeled the conditions of the local markets offer into the Berlin collections and the circumstances of the local art market specificities, the navigation and deals between the dealers and the church and owners, the parochies and so on, that were reserving some works for themselves and thus have influenced the offer of the dealers, that influence what Bode was able to purchase and promote and write about. It is thus undeniable that Bode was one of the foremost agents in the marketplace of the last 3 decades of the 19th century. He had the power to establish or revoke attributions and thus power over value and demand, amplified by the fact that the dealers knew that he could easily create demand within the web of advisees. Bode's huge network, paired with his reputation as an eminent connoisseur, enabled him to mediate in any direction he pleased, to create demand for the objects he needed to place, to reward the dealers with whom he desired to maintain a strategic relationship, or to establish a collecting trade, almost. Bode's agency was probably most palpable in the influence he had on taste and market prices. His interest, for instance, in the sculpture of Donatello and that of Thunmann Riemenschneider helped establish these artists and their works within the art historical canon, and his ongoing purchases for the Berlin museums and his advisees created a market for these artists. Bode's taste-making also contributed to the creation of the market for the painting of Johannes Vermeer, as has been shown by Esmee Kortbach in the volume. Bode unscrupulously used his skillful rhetoric and authoritative expertise to achieve his own goals, sometimes at the price of hypocrisy. The various contradictions in Bode's art market activity were aptly described by Bode's pupil Wilhelm Valentina, when he perceptively wrote that Bode was, I quote, as much a politician as he was a scholar. The fact that he was able to achieve so much in both spheres without becoming aware of their inherent moral contradictions was the source of his strength. The end of quote. Now moving to the second entanglement. Although Bode depended on works of art to achieve the goal of outperforming other European museums and of establishing a comprehensive collection of art masters in Berlin. As noted by Ian Hodder, there is a darker side to the entanglements of humans and objects, where I quote, our relations with things are often asymmetrical, leading to entrapments and particular pathways from which it is difficult to escape. End of quote. After Hodder, I define entanglement now in the second part as an involvement in a complicated situation or in circumstances from which it is difficult to disengage. It was under such circumstances that in the realm of late 19th century art collecting, in many instances, Bode was entangled by the works that he was only able to purchase for Berlin by means of a far-reaching, multi-layered network and use of often complex stratagems. In order to understand how Bode operated through his social network, it is helpful to shift the focus to Bode's lesser-known contacts within his network, often based in sites on the periphery of the main art collecting centers, such as Carpi in Genoa in Italy, Oldenburg in Germany, and Prague in the Austrian Empire, all cases explored in the volume, which nonetheless proved crucial nodes in the multidimensional social web through which Bode exerted his influence. Fulgazzanelli identified the horizontal and vertical nature of Bode's strategic networking, observing that his network spanned a multiplicity of actors, from dealers, collectors, and scholars to museum and government officials, who encompassed a surprising diversity of professional statuses. That is, from high-end collectors and world-class dealers to local shop owners and amateurs, the whole spectrum of gelato, if you will. Patrizia Cappellini and Michele Azzurro acted as analyzers by introducing the variety of levels of dealers, antiquarians, and intermediaries with whom Bode worked in Florence and Genoa. Established expert antiquarian connoisseurs like Stefano Bardini, but also the common so-called negozianti, the simple rigattieri, as well as the mezzani. So all spectrum of professional, semi-professional dealers, or even amateurs, painters and collectors who were not professional dealers, but who occasionally mediated art transactions. The strategic multidimensionality of this network, which gave them access to a wide variety of information, from objects on sale to the details of art expert controls, and also enabled him to send undercover agents to auctions so that the price wouldn't go too high, because it would be clear that Bode was purchasing for Berlin Museum. And to orchestrate donations was the key to Bode's success in the many roles he assumed within the art world. Bode viewed his relationships with collectors as assets and used them in his policy of maintaining privileged long-term relationships with some art dealers. This was the case in his almost 20 years long advisory to Louis Bachar and Burkhardt, a small-scale private collector in Basel. Unbeknownst to Bachar and Burkhardt, Bode was also advising the dealer Julius Böhler in Munich about which works Böhler could He was advising Böhler about which works Böhler could offer her, suggesting suitable prices, and finally mediating directly between the collector and the dealer, who would later return the favor when Bode needed it. From the beginning, Bode knew that the only purpose of Bachar and Burkhardt's collecting activity was to donate the entire collection to the Kunstmuseum Basel. So she's an unusual case. And I'm showing you here the exhibition of her works at the Kunstmuseum Basel entitled Bilderlist in October 2019 to 2020. And there's a wonderful article by one of the curators, Gabriele Dechter, on relationship between Bachar and Burkhardt and Bode in the catalogue of the exhibition. Although a single case of Bachar and Burkhardt's donation to Berlin museums can be traced, with just one, and they cooperated for 20 years. What was more important to Bode was to integrate the Basel collector, who would quickly prove to be a reliable, regular, and grateful buyer, also of works of doubtful quality, as a useful tie in his network of art dealers and collectors. This gave Bode several advantages. On the one hand, he was able to keep an eye on the whereabouts of those artworks that he did not consider important enough for the museums in Berlin or Strasbourg, or for those collectors for whom he had for donations to Berlin. On the other hand, he had the opportunity to relatively easy channel Böhler's stock to her collection and then profit from whatever Böhler would do for him in return, to return the favor. Or to easily resell artworks that he bought himself, but didn't consider good enough for one of his museums or other collectors. Bode made it clear, and this is Gabriele Detter's research, unpublished research, unfortunately. Bode made it clear to others that Bachar and Burkhardt served him as one of the many options in such a chain of disposal of artworks, at, I would say, the chain's lower end. So Bauhoff and Burkhardt is one of these sort of lower standing collectors within this wide web of collectors of various prominence, starting from Prince Johann of Liechtenstein, for instance, and ending with, for instance, with her. And there are many other cases, I'm sure, of other such collectors that Bode was using for his hands in the same way. On the other hand, through voluntary catalogue writing for more powerful collectors, Bode was creating the opportunity to disseminate his views and attributions, as argued by Sebastian Tolle and Martha Anna Falk in their essay on Bode and the collection of the Grand Duke of Oldenburg in the volume, as well as winning long-term connections that could facilitate future donations or acquisitions, as is shown also in the volume by Michaela Watt-Belot in her essay on a Prague collector Adalbert von Lange, also a relatively peripheral collector who worked with Bode, whom Bode chose to work with. Bode emerges as the mediator who networked and connected important actors within the marketplace, thereby increasing his own clout and ability to steer events. An exemplary instance of this tactic was his orchestration, the donation by the Prince Johann II of Liechtenstein of the bronze group of Venus and Amma by Benedikt Bunzelbauer to the Museum of Decorative Arts in Prague. The sculpture was offered to Berlin. However, since it was executed in Prague, Bode advised the collector and museum board member of the Prague National Gallery, Adalbert von Lange, to purchase it for Prague. When Lange brought the sculpture to Prague, but in the end could not raise the funds for the donation, Bode informed his another contact in Central Europe, Prince Johann II of Liechtenstein, who eventually purchased the figure and donated it to Prague. So in the end, Bode succeeded at what he desired to do. Interest has hitherto been chiefly concentrated on Bode's advisory and cooperation with the biggest and most prestigious collectors and dealers at the time, such as the mentioned Prince Johann II of Liechtenstein and the dealers Stefano Bardini and Joseph de Ville, for instance. The network of collectors served by Bode outside Berlin, along with the intentions and goals of his advisory to a geographically widespread network of collectors of lower standing, however, have been less investigated. Only a broader view that takes into account unlikely advisees without big spending power, based outside of main collecting centers, and crucially with no intentions to donate artworks to Berlin, such as Louis Bauhoff and Burkhardt, sheds light on the extent of the influence Bode enjoyed within the art marketplace and the complex modus operandi he used to establish and maintain his powerful position within it. While proposing to shift the focus to the lower echelons of Bode's network, I think this volume only initiated research that will at some point ideally lead to a broader, still broader understanding of the many levels of his social ties and the roles within his web and his system. And we need to still explore a lot within his network. And we also need a visualization of this. I think another task for another group of scholars, and we just talked about this with Inigo yesterday, and digital humanities. To sum up, Bode emerges as one of the first museum professionals of the 19th century to engage deeply and widely in conscious, efficacy-oriented networking among the realms of museum practice and art scholarship, collecting, and trade. As such, he is a subject of study that morphs into an archaeology of the strategic bonds continuously forged by curators with collectors, art dealers, and art scholars up to the present day, while demonstrating the particular consequences of these interconnections on the birth of the art historical canon in the late 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really exciting and brilliant event. So I would like to ask now our expert on behind border, Professor Gege, yes, our comment.
Okay. Can I say here?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
You're most welcome.
Well,
The mic-
would I sit there? Should I sit-
No, perhaps.
No, okay.
Just
Yeah.
move the microphone.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to respond to the presentation of Dr. Zernack. I hope you will not be too disappointed if you are looking for a controversial and critical debate today. I have to assert at the very beginning of my remarks that I fully agree with her findings, mostly. I can only congratulate her to the results of her books, Muggling the Renaissance, the illicit export of artworks out of Italy, which gives astonishing insights on Bode's sometimes ruthless actions on the Italian art market, as well as her lecture today, which embraces the role of Bode in a larger European art market context. I am, of course, alluding also, if not mostly, to the colloque about this topic at the University of Bern a couple of years ago, which she initiated. And this is the important publication, One Bode and the Art Market, which followed and just came out, and which she edited and prefaced that I will make a little propaganda for this book. The initiative, which includes the participation of an experienced group of European and American scholars, enlarges our knowledge on Bode's activities on the European market in a substantial way. We now understand much better his still somewhat enigmatic personality and his working process. He was definitely respected and honored, the most influential but also redoubtable museum director in Europe before and after 1900. A lot has already been written about Bode and the art market. The special virtue of this new book, edited by Johanna, is that it presents in all the papers new material. These hitherto undiscovered documents are convincingly analyzed in their historical context. Dr. Zernack points out that they address not the mainstream of the important European collectors and art dealers, but lesser known personalities. However, in my opinion, the research outcome covers very much the central questions of Bode's methodology using the art market. It is said that Bode sometimes wrote about 100 letters a day. The Zentralarchiv at the Staatliche Museum in Berlin keeps 30,000 letters by 6,000 correspondents, and that was not everything. No doubt that this workaholic author had built an astonishing network for his professional goals. The book presents case studies. These case studies surprise, however, by their contribution to a more specific understanding, not only of Bode's activity, but also of the development of the European art market in general. I repeat, I very much agree with Johanna's presentation. I will, however, try to make some remarks which are not in opposition to what has been said, but rather point out what can be learned by listening to her presentation and by reading the book. Sometimes I might try to ask for some additional explanation. So, first, research. Bode wanted to enlarge the Prussian royal collections, to bring them to the quality of the level of the Louvre and the National Gallery of London was his and his emperor's ambition. However, from the beginning of his career on, his modus operandi was building a network, yes, but the basis was research. This is also reflected in the papers of the book. It might have been stressed a little bit more. Bode's foundation of the Florentine Institute of Art History, which was created not only for visiting museum directors, but for scholars and local art dealers, was a major enterprise to establish an institution which would finally serve as a basis to write the history of Italian art. It is often written that Bode used all the tricks possible to get works of art for his museums at low prices and find ways for their export, even neglecting the official laws. This seems to be true in some cases. However, it is much less stressed that his network was based on a collegiality by sharing knowledge and experience. He only could build up his network because he answered hundreds, no thousands of letters with photographs, mostly by dealers asking not only for an attribution, but looking for a suggestion of a price. Fulvia Sancinelli quotes a letter by Pietro Foresti to Bode. I quote, "I'm kindly writing to Bode. I'm kindly asking you if you could be so nice to tell me what you think about this painting and at what price I should get to." End of quote. In the introduction of the book and her presentation, Johanna rightly referred to the revealing fact that the president of the Association of German Trade in Art and Antiquities at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, he honored the late general director of the Prussian Museums by a speech pointing out his exceptional relationship with the art trade. He especially emphasized, quote, the beneficial interrelationship between the museum and the art trade, which was based on a sound scientific foundation, becoming, quote, an important factor in the world's art trade. The important dealer firms like Agnew, Sotheby's, Knoedler, Wildenstein, Bardini, Sedlmayr, De Wiengray, and many others started to build up libraries and archives. This material, especially photographs, allowed or helped to trace back the history of works of art, ideally into the studio of the artist, or make attributions on the basis of connoisseurship, often with the help of photographs. Unhappily, many of these archives are lost. Only very few institutions, like the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, or recently the SADC at the University of Cologne, exist to collect these important sources in a systematic way. Galleries tend not to make public their archives by obvious reasons, to keep confidentiality about prices and the names of clients. Second, provenance. Studies on the art market were intensified during the last 2 or 3 decades. The process developed parallel to the efforts to research the provenances of works in museums and private collections to ensure their ownership, especially after the Second World War. A new field of research for art historians and a new category of the discipline was created in the museum: provenance research. We are still at the beginning of this process. A lot has still to be done, not only by discovering the exploiting documents, it is necessary to finally embrace provenance research in the structure of university education. The Forum Kunst and Markt at the Technical University Berlin might be the first step. Provenance research has to be the ethical basis of the art trade. However, this professionalization of the art market has only developed as a goal since the second half of the 20th century. And we should remind the fact that this ethical aspect was not at the very beginning of provenance research in the 19th century, rather than at this time to ascertain the authorship of a work of art, much less the ownership. Most of the papers in recent publications, especially in serious studies in the history of collecting art markets edited by Christian Römer, in which also Johanna's book was published, rely on conserved and accessible archives by the art trade or papers museum or by museum curators like Bode. Provenance history is also the basis of the diverse case studies presented in this book, Johanna edited. It is a great example to demonstrate the importance of this field of research. And beyond this, the book is extremely relevant because it reveals the contribution of connoisseurship and academic work by the art trade to rewrite the history of art and define the art historical canon. In a certain way, the book covers not only the topic Bode and the art market, it could also be titled The Art Market and Bode. 3. Entanglements. We learn by the authors of Willem Bode and the Art Market about the entanglements and intertwinements, terms which become keywords also in Johanna's presentation. My question is, and I'm perhaps only expressing an insecure feeling, why not also speak about cooperation, collaboration, or use the contemporary term teamwork? Bode used his astonishing network sometimes by impermissible ways, yes. However, to cooperate with or even support art dealers by sharing his outstanding connoisseurship, Bode helped to them to unearth works of art and to understand the historical and art historical relevance. I just want to be sure that I'm not misunderstanding. Bode learned by and with the art dealers. They were necessary partners, not only for his museum acquisitions, but especially for his scholarship. By reading the book, Willem Bode and the Art Market, I sometimes had the slight feeling that some authors tried to get wise to Bode's activities. Mit einmal in Deutsch zu sagen, als liebten sie ihn auf die Schliche zu kommen. In this sense, we read about strategic participation, multidimensionality, undercover agents and auctions, orchestrations, and donations, adopting different, often contradictory professional identities, spies. In truth, the so-called entanglements were part of a hugely successful method to rewrite art, to acquire works of art and to present them to a general public for enjoyment and education. Yes, Bode and the art dealers participated in establishing or changing the canon of art history. Yes, the dealers even profited financially, and Bode was able to find the works he needed for his museum, sometimes with a discount. What is wrong with them? Is this not still the practice today? Was it not a merit and a success to evolve an art market which is founded on education and professional life? Perhaps my sometimes slightly different understanding of entanglements, which carry some pejorative elements would have been avoided if one paper had demonstrated the situation of the art market before this involvement, when the discipline was in its very use in the middle of the 19th century. In her excellent paper in Johanna's edited book, Patrizia Capellini quoted from Bode's introduction to a catalog of an exhibition organized by Luigi Grassi and resumed the relationship with the Florentine dealers. I quote, "Taking this brief text as a document on Bode's relationship with dealers in the Florentine art market, we may conclude that Stefano Bardini, Elia Volpi, and Luigi Grassi were more than simply dealers for him. They were points of reference for exhibitions, consulting, and for his research on works, for his publications and studies." End of quote. Bode's vision. It is generally known that the art market developed new and highly intensity during the second half of the 19th century. Two reasons caused the European and American Revolution. On the one hand, the richness of important works which were offered by the art market. The European noblesse needed to sell some of their works of art because of the economic downturn of their architectural income. As collectors, they have been replaced by national museums and successful rich entrepreneurs of the industrial age. On the other hand, the ambition of and competition between some nations, especially Great Britain, France, and Germany, as well as private collectors in the United States, to build important collections representing their political and cultural self-consciousness. Bode was at the center of this development. In fact, was probably the most dynamic player in this international arena. These known facts are preconditions for which the authors of the book start. They illuminate Bode's activities all over Europe. The papers offered surprising insights in his adventurous search for new material to be collected in the museums and for publications. The focus on the art market is, of course, legitimate, and in this case, highly original. However, what can we do more, and how can we move into further research? The range of questions asked may be enlarged in the future. For example, although the building that the development of an art historian was sometimes addressed, in the case of Rembrandt, there seems to be room for investigations in the general aesthetic reception of the artists promoted by the art market. Bode's vision and ambition was to establish the museum with a clear message. The museum should not only embody the political and cultural power of the Prussian state and the German nation during the German Empire. The museum should present the most prestigious work of art, especially in the Renaissance Museum, because they embody models of a humanistic Weltanschauung. Bode relied his whole life on Jakob Burckhardt and Jakob Burckhardt's writings. He never traveled to Italy without Burckhardt's Cicerone. The famous historian had trusted to him the commentaries of the many re-editions of the book. The art trade was not only an enterprise of prestige and politics, it was part of a general intellectual, artistic, and cultural revival of these idealized periods, the Italian Renaissance and the cultural age. The American danger. The book does not cover the important changes of the European art market when more and more American collectors invested high amounts into the acquisitions of European paintings, sculptures, and antiquities, as well as contemporary art. Bode has complained this situation in many articles, admiring at the same time the engagement of the American tycoons, especially Altman, Baldwin, and others. The art market moved over the Atlantic. Bode started to write catalogs for Morgan and others. This, however, is a topic for another volume, which also might be called Bode and the art market. For Bode, these years were mostly years of frustration. The happy years presented in Dr. Schweitzel's book were gone since many years. Fulvia Zaninelli quotes in her paper Memoirs of the art dealer Augusto Giandolo, who met Bode around 1900. I quote, "I was barely 30 years old when I first met Dr. Bode. I still remember the kind word that the German had for me when he realized how nervous I was. It might sound a little strange, but you would have to have lived during that era to understand what Bode represented at the time. Indeed, Bode was then the most authoritative expert of Italian art in the world. He did not brag about it. He was an easy and accessible man, willing to admit his own mistakes. He dressed formally and modestly. Bode, in his later years, was impatient, severe, redoubtable, and although honored, he was deeply disappointed. In his old age, he was cool and repellent and bitter. The art market had moved into another direction, the modernism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So, would you like to respond to the comment?
Thank you very much. I do agree with Vega as well, to be honest, but a couple of thoughts that I have. Starting with the with Burckhardt and Cicerone and the reception of the Italian Renaissance, because that's my field, and I think about this a lot because, of course, Burckhardt initiated what we see now in Florence with the masses of tourists going to Florence and doing that what they did. It wouldn't happen without Burckhardt, but it also wouldn't happen without Bode
Yes.
and his network.
Yes.
So I think the main how I see art market, the importance of what we do in art market studies now, at least from the perspective that I champion, is to expose the role of art markets, and by art markets I mean every individual, scholars as clients, and dealers and intermediaries as well, in creation, in co-creation of those canons. And Italian Renaissance is of course the biggest example of something that in Smuggling to Renaissance I call it visual indoctrination without a possibility of remediation, etc. Because of course we had Burckhardt who educated certain generations of 19th century elites and 19th century travelers to Italy, but then the generation of Bode and his collectors and his and the dealers whom he empowered came and furnished all corners of Western world with those works of art, and with photographs of those works of art. and of course contributed to further publications of Bode and others because of the access to those works of art. As said, unearthed in many cases, especially in Italy, but also elsewhere, by those dealers. So in a way, and I think maybe it's true for Vermeer as well, and maybe to some extent to Rembrandt, but certainly for Vermeer, I think it was, as we know, unknown to basically unknown by mid-19th century. The art market really played a crucial role. Those individuals played a crucial role in canonizing these works and in propagating visually those works of art. Let's remember the first publications of Bode's generation were already illustrated. And those collectors of all sorts, it's not just Isabella Stewart Gardner and the likes of this social standing, but also as we tried to show all social ladder almost of the sort of from middle class to upper middle class to foreign aristocrats, right? Who then further perpetuated that visual canon that we live today. That we still live today. So there was a Donatello show here and elsewhere, and it's also because of Bode's writing. But and now I move to another point. It's of course also because of Bardini. And when you ask what's wrong about these cooperations, of course they were fruitful. They were immensely fruitful. But we can't forget that we've got the realm of scholarship with its goals, and we've got the realm of commerce with its pecuniary goals and various moral standards. So if we bear the case of Bardini, we recall the case of Bardini. And I think many of you here know the scholarship of Lynn Catterson, for instance, Bardini is very problematic because of fate, to some extent fates that he provided. So a wall of Donatellos, now we laugh about this, but it was fruitful, but if that cooperation was not critical on the part of scholars, and I sometimes think that Bode fell prey to some of these dealers. He actively contaminated the canon with dealers, right? In a way, expanding what dealers try to market. And that was not always original. In terms of there were also facts that got into canon, I think, and of course the Rembrandt examples is also the case. But I think we need to bear this in mind. I fully agree that this was a fruitful collaboration, and art history as we know it now functions like this. That's why I called it archaeology, because in a way that was it. That's why the comparison with what was before would be indeed telling as well. But I think I don't know how this really works now with contemporary art market, where the cooperation with curators and dealers and artists themselves is just. In art historians, right? It's just as dynamic as it was back then in the realm of art masters. To what extent there is awareness on the part of scholars that, of course, there are marketing strategies and there are different goals on the part of the on the side of the art market, and I think that that is generally my impression that. Bode sometimes was played by those figures, and that's
and the other way around. And the other way around. That's what I'm saying.
Yes. More because we know we are now correcting sort of maybe a Bode Or the question is, of course, to what extent Bode was doing it because he wanted to do it and accrue other benefits from that, you know, accepting one fate to do his part of work.
I think we are not really in conflict, unhappily. It would perhaps be more lively if we wouldn't disagree, but there's only one slight question I have, and that is that these terms, entanglement and so on, they have a little taste, you know, and I think that it was more a collaboration in a certain sense, and Bode was really open to his partners, so I am only careful not to judge in a certain way. And you know, in all these papers, and not only in this book but in other books too, it is a little bit like, well, Bode and it's some kind of
Wrongdoing.
right. No, wrong. It's not wrongdoing, but you know, there was something under the table going on, yeah, and which sometimes really happened. It's not that it was out of the question; it really happened. So, and Bode, he wanted what he wanted. He wanted. On the other hand, it was a collaboration between them, and he had a very open sense for those people from whom he learned.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perhaps everything I wanted to say. It was a kind of partnership where he put out his advantages, they had their advantages, and it was, you know, today sometimes people think, don't touch our dealers. I think this is completely wrong. I'm more on the side of Bode, that these are partners, they do their job, and we can learn from them. And Bode understood that they could found this material he was interested in, and that was the most important argument. And the artists knew exactly what they could have from Bode. And you know, this is the time when connoisseurship came up, and Bode was one of the best of them. He made mistakes, of course, every connoisseur made a mistake, but they profited of his knowledge, and he profited, first of all, of their experience and the fact that they could actually. So that's what I wanted to argue a little bit, that in this whole book, which is really excellent, let's not in this whole book, this kind of little could be a slightly more I would say this relationship between the dealers and Bode could have sometimes another touch. So you see what I mean? He had an open way to talk with dealers, and entanglements. You know, all these terms should be in a certain way discussed and understood in the context of this time. And the basis also for the 20th century and the 21st century art market can be found in this period.
Absolutely.
And so there is a continuity to our times. And I think that can be learned from your book, but the terms might a little bit be, might be a little bit less going to the direction we have found out how he was doing. No, it was not the way I think he would. Is that clear what I mean?
Yeah, I think so,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I very do agree with the fact that both parties absolutely needed each other and depended on each other. And dependent on each other for their own success in their respective fields.
Yeah.
yeah, the question is a little bit to what extent. Well, this is because Bode was not a theoretician; he was the connoisseur, basically, right? So he needed this sort of hands-on experience of the dealers that he didn't in Italy, for instance, that he didn't have, right? No, it's just not. It's not just about where to find the works, but sort of unearth them, but also what just the knowledge of the works themselves, of the earths, of the restoration processes as well. So in that he was much more dependent on the dealer side, on the sort of very well educated, but in a different way, right? Educated in this different sort of paradigm. Dealers, for instance, in Italy, most of them were former painters or sculptors.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about collaboration, they sort of, I got that's the word. Oh, I'm just sorry. Complemented. Okay, sorry. They so basically those two realms complemented each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Very well. But as said, there was a danger to it, right? So, it would have worked. It worked, but there was a danger that was sometimes created some kind of I think indeed dangerous for art history in the moment when it was still in this very fluid period, right? It was still really being written. And we need to understand at the moment we know this. Almost there's no problem at all when we just sort of figure out what happened and what was right, who influenced what. Then we can rewrite the canons, right? It's interesting. I think what we wanted to show was how that was created, because many of those catalog resumes, like Rembrandt, like Vermeer, of course, like Donatello, like much of works of Donatello, of course, have been written now. But we need to understand why we had to rewrite them. We had to write it. That was because of these dangers created by such close cooperation with the other market. I wanted to touch upon on the scientific basis, which is of course, I mean, Bode's main field was scholarship, although I tend to think that he was probably a better politician than an art historian, but this is up for a debate. Also in terms of connoisseurship, I wonder, because he was a specialist in so many fields in the end. To what extent was he really good in all of them? There's a very interesting comment by Klaus, who is, by the way, his arch sort of enemy, so it needs to be taken into account.
Yeah.
To what extent?
Well, he was very eager to publish, and he published every day almost. Yeah. So I think he had an enormous ambition to bring out his publications, and he needed the art dealers for his publications, and that could have been stressed a little bit more, because when he went to Italy or to other places, he needed the material, and he right away tried to get it into his publication, and he learned from it. He learned from, should pieces be added, should things be restored, and the dealers often, in many cases, did it already, which was not a good idea to do, because Bode was critical about what they did. So I think there was a common interest to build this, to understand the history of, let's say, Italian art or Dutch art or whatever. So in my view, he highly respected, let's say this, he highly respected the art dealers, knowing that they also would not tell him everything.
Yeah.
But he was a real partner. and he couldn't live without them, and they couldn't live without them. So it was a real collaboration, and the words you used, I can identify with them too, but I wanted to have this other side,
Which is excellent, yeah, because we need to remember this, yeah.
So and that's all I wanted to bring into it.
Thank you. I have two other comments.
Yeah.
The work of Bode in terms of his publications and promotion of art history in general, and another connection to art market. He used in this very cunning, shrewd maneuvering that he was so excellent at, in navigating all this network and seeing benefit in place, seeing chances of benefiting one place in a completely distant geographical place, in a completely different social tie. And so interestingly, for instance, the Historisches Institute in Florence, that I'm, by the way, studying right now, so things are really emerging now, that when Bode was very, very focused on collecting the funding for the institute,
He did a lot for that.
Of course, all the time, but he's basically all the time. He was highly focused on sort of collecting the funding after the reopening, after the First World War, when it was almost because the subscriptions went away. It was impossible. It was basically impossible to carry out the work of the institute. And then I'm finding things in the art market where Bode was really channeling some funds, some funding from his work for art, for instance, for the Duke of the Grand Duke of Oldenburg, and for some other work that he did within the sort of art market advisory. He channeled these funds, and not always just to the private museums for further acquisitions, but also to promote to fund the institute, and has promoted scholarship, German scholarship in Italy. So of course this is another facet of Bode, of this sort of scholarly political side, but this sort of political side devoted to promotion of German scholarship. But still intermingled with his art market activity, or sort of his art market activity, it's taken to support his other activities. I think this is very interesting how holistic he was.
He had a real openness to scholarship, publication, connoisseurship, and research, and that was the basis. And this was a unique combination in one. And then he was also a very good politician, and defending his position against the emperor, or with the emperor, convincing him. All these different, but there is a kind of equilibrium between them. And I only wanted to say that we should be very careful with these terms.
Yeah, I fully understand.
And just be careful not to judge after, a simple understanding of these terms. So he, of course, he was not an easy character at all. He was a very difficult character. And I don't know if I wanted to have worked under him, but he was somebody who, in a certain sense, and that is a little less brought out in the publications, he had a vision. And this vision was, basically Burckhardt's vision. It was the vision that Italian art and the Renaissance was a period of deep humanism, which he in a certain way embodied, and that's what he wanted to show in the Renaissance Museum. That's why it was a Renaissance museum. Yeah, it didn't become a Renaissance museum. There was all kind of different other things in there. But the idea was it is a Renaissance museum, and it should be labeled Renaissance museum because it was convinced of this idea of humanism, which had to be transferred to the general public.
Yeah, I think okay.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of this educative potential, right?
Yes.
Just as the kind of beginning, I think Bode was in a way the best that Burckhardt could hope for, right? Yeah. In terms of propagation of all of his vision. Yeah, that's for sure. Really, all market and collectively, things that Burckhardt wouldn't have done.
No, that was not his interest.
Yeah. I have another comment on the sort of importance of provenance research, which is, I think, clear to all of us, both here and online. But I think what is important in these kind of publications and this kind of method of using provenance research is to not treat it as a linear understanding, sort of linear provenance research. I once said that each comma in this provenance chain really is a huge story that represents usually a huge portion of cultural history.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're trying to do here, and that's why provenance research is still so promising, I think. But it needs to be done also in this way, because all the Italians is not a place to discuss this, but I think generally the focus is on just getting very quickly the information of the provenance chain without really delving into those moments of transition.
Yeah. No, I agree with this completely. I just wanted to point out that John, in your book, and I realized that when I was reading it, there is a big difference between the 19th century and our times, because we are looking for the ownership, and at that time they were looking at the authorship. So that is a huge difference, and that merits paper in a certain way, because it's such a big difference. We now think of who owned this. And we are tracing back, we are looking for the chain to go back to the owner, because we wanted to rescue. This is our contemporary problem. But the 19th century didn't have this.
Of course, provenance has.
The change of the term has to be struck.
Yes, and I think we need to, as art market studies, we need to to move on, right? And take full advantage of what this kind of approach to art history has, and ask all the questions that can be asked and should be asked. But it's still, there are many publications that do it already, but there's still, I think, in general, awareness and general understanding of what provenance research is. It's not really yet really rooted.
No, it's not common yet.
Yeah.
But if we look into the 19th century, we know what they were looking for.
Yeah.
Well, it's really very interesting to listen to this conversation and this intellectual exchange. It's really fascinating. I would like to still come a little bit back to the problem of demitologizing Bode, as you mentioned, and perhaps maybe is questioning his role and those ethic aspects exactly. So you, Professor Gekens, was mentioning also, we are raising this problem of the role of Renaissance Italian art, how idealized it was also, and how it was. The question would be interesting, I guess, to think whether this was a pure fascination with this art, with this culture, whether it was also somehow instrumentalized, not forgetting also the let's say professional occupation of order and this political engagement. And here you were, Joanna, you were more, let's say, you were mentioning that he was more politician or as art historian. So it would be interesting for me also to question this kind of relationship and maybe between him as art historian and as a politician. Was he more an art historian than a politician, or was he more politician as an art historian? And as I said, this was it pure and sort of innocent fascination with this culture and sort of transmitting it to the Prussian field. Having this back in mind that he was definitely part of the imperial machinery, yes. So maybe touching upon also those ethical questions which are concerning also provenance research and post-colonial aspects, and with this debate which is already for many years driving or also up to date in museology, European, especially Western museology, but also in Eastern or Central European museology. So yes, this aspect of order, can we say that he was absolutely yes, can we demetologize in this perspective, and can we like state was it more political engagement, because this I think is not clear to me, and it was maybe not also so exposed in the book, or this matter was not that mentioned in your book. Would you like to?
Well, I think he was a cultural diplomat, right? And in terms of cultural diplomacy of the Prussian Empire, I think he was one of the most important and I would argue probably one of the most successful actors within that cultural diplomacy and the Kaiserreich. And of course, if you're asking about the Italian Renaissance art, if it was instrumentalized on all possible fronts, I think, in terms of because we are in post-Burkhardian times, and it was and not only it has always been prestigious. Raphael has always had aristocratic connotations in terms of art collections and so on. It's always been sort of a desired luxury good and a token of prestige. And with Burckhardt and Bode, other Renaissance artists, Italian Renaissance artists like Donatello, I think precisely because of Bode and Bardini, sort of joins this group of artists that can be easily, his works, right, can be within that visual fascination with Italian Renaissance in the late 19th century can be easily deployed for for goals, political goals and here I mean cultural diplomacy. And of course the context is clear, right? We are in a country that, just as the US, right? That joins the European stage and as a power player relatively late and needs to position itself culturally with Great Britain, in comparison, in confrontation with Great Britain with Paris.
Sort of imperial grace, yes, in terms of cultural policy.
Of course. So what I always argue is that this conspicuous consumption, I always talk about Veblen and Bourdieu in this regard, and the process was just as it was with Nouveau Riche collectors. We got a Nouveau Riche country, if you will. I don't know if you agree, but almost, right, in terms of unified Prussia, that booms economically, that becomes an important political player. Suddenly, they start acquire colonies because they want to, right, in a way they imitate the policies and, if you will, the representational policies of the established players, right? It's Bourdieu. It's imitation of those who are among who you aspire to be or who you aspire to replace. And of course, the same happens on the level of museums, of the collections.
I might drop a little something different in the water.
Please go ahead.
Please, I'm good.
Well, you know, Bode was very unhappy when the emperor decided to ennoble him.
Okay.
He didn't like that at all. He comes out of a bourgeois family. His whole life, he was very proud of being a Brunswick bourgeois family coming from that. And it's his father and his grandfather, they were in the administration of the city and so on and so on. And we should be very careful not to identify him closely to the Empire Society. And if you look into the Empire Society, it's very complicated. We have very different levels. But he is not a friend of the Junkers and of this ruling. He had his problems with the emperor, and he, of course, managed to get what he needed from him, but this was not his society. And so his identification was an ideal. I mean, you're right in saying that, oh, this is a myth, but it's very interesting that during the empire, there is this bourgeois society which identifies with the Dutch 17th century rich collectors and the Medici. So I think this is a very important, a new biography has to be written on Bode. So perhaps you could do that. But I have to hold, but we could do it. And I think we can now, we know much more now. Since 20 or 30 years of a lot of scholarship about this period and about Bode, it can be done, and we have a different look on him. We also distinguish between the early Bode and the later Bode. And the Bode before the First World War and after the First World War, which are really different characters. And we have much more knowledge. 30 years ago, nobody really has read all these letters we have now, and so it should be. And then it is also necessary that an art historian writes it, and not an historian, or the historian should talk to this art historian and vice versa. But there are some aspects which are where we need some help, the historian. But all this can be done now because we have, grâce à vous, we have you have discovered so many new stories. These are all. This book is about stories. There's nothing else than stories. And these stories, you try to pull in your preface these stories together. And you did that very brilliantly. But these are different stories, and there can be more. And if we would collect all these different stories, the series of Christian Wimmer, this collection series has to be taken together and then pull out the personality and identity of Bode. And that can be much better done now after we have all this material together. So what I wanted to say, I'm careful with these kind of arguments. You're completely right. These questions have to be discussed, but we have to look into the history of Buddha, his background, which was a real proud bourgeois
So
background.
Michael
Yes. And he was he had of course to live with the court in a certain sense, but he was not a courtier. He was in opposition to certain parts of the court. He used the court for his ambitions, and his ambition for the museum was not completely an imperial vision. You know, think of the opening of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, where he was sitting on up on the balcony and watched down to the assembly, where they were all in uniforms and with all the military brilliance, and he was part of that. And he didn't want. I mean, he could have put his chair. He had a special chair to move forward because of his illness, but he could have put himself down if he wanted to. But he didn't want to. But this was not the opening of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum was not his affair. In a sense, so he didn't want to be part of this court.
Thank you for that, because I've asked myself many times if there was, we're talking about nationalist art histories and narratives, and as we also mentioned, but indeed, I was asking myself, was he a nationalist?
Yeah.
And I also think he wasn't. So it's precisely what I think. The two visions coincided. The sort of smaller vision, in terms of scope of Bode, of his museum, and of him as a scholar, as a full guardian, if you will, and the imperial one of the Kaiser. Right. And since they collided, right? Yes. They were both so successful on the level of cultural diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and Bode's strategy to expand the museum. Okay. So I think it's in terms of the history of the Berlin museums, it's just a very lucky coincidence.
Yeah, his friends were the art dealers, the collectors. They were not noble.
Yeah.
And the upper middle class. These were his friends. Yeah. And they were also members of his Kaiser Friedrich Museum.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should address our audience, because it's about time. I think we have to finish soon our really inspiring and very, very interesting conversation. We have no questions from our online audience, but perhaps anyone would like to ask still a question. Yes, Hannah, please go ahead.
Thank you. First, thank you all very much, and thank you, Professor Guidance, Professor Smaltas, for this rich discussion. I'm absolutely very interested in the personality of the Bode, because I'm from Zernack Museum in Kyiv, and the museum founded by the couple of them, and they have personal connection. They are one part, tiny, maybe, part of this grand network of Bode. The Central Archive I found a few years ago in Berlin, letters from Zernack to someone in French, referring to Bode and to his consulting Hanenko's two painters of Rembrandt, which, what is interesting now, especially interesting later, were not recognized as Rembrandt. But Bode confirmed the authorship of Rembrandt. And later, due to new research, they are not attributed. But what I wanted to say, Hanenko's, I listened to you both. I discovered how I knew it before, but I had some ideas of that Bogdan Hanenko, the founder of the first national history museum in Ukraine, in Kyiv, and then the first and the biggest among his own collection, their own collection, the biggest art, universal art museum in Kyiv, now the Zernack Museum. He personally was very fascinated with body, and it can be observed in the contents of the collection, which in Kyiv, which is of course really much smaller, but it is really encyclopedic, including, as I can see now, all the key interests of Wilhelm von Bode. It's kind of, a reflection in a drop of water, but it still consists of the vast Ukrainian collection of Islamic art, of Egyptian, old Egyptian rarities, of antique art, of Netherlandish and Dutch art, of Italian painting, on Italian sculpture, and so on. So the interests were the same. I suspect that Hanenko just followed his interests. And also it is interesting that, as you said, Professor Gaggans, that Bode was not absolutely did not associate himself absolutely with empire. It was he had certain strategy in relations with Kaiser's empire. And Bogdan in this aspect is a very interesting figure in the context of history of Ukraine and Russian Empire, because being very loyal to imperial court in St. Petersburg, he played his own game, and he persuaded. It was a greatest political achievement that he was allowed by the emperor to found the National History Museum in Kyiv, and that which was much more difficult to achieve. He was allowed. He gained the permission to found the art museum, the World Art Museum. So he played actually against this politics of metropolis, to accumulate both political and cultural power, and have only there in St. Petersburg and in also the World Art History Museums. And in that context of Hanenko and Bode, and the context of art markets, also non-European art market, which makes another aspect of Bode's activity and his entanglement or engagement into geopolitical situation of his time. I would like to ask a question which for me is personally very sensitive, extremely sensitive, because I'm a historian of Hanenko. His biography and his archives are lost, so it's quite a task to reconstruct his history, professional and personal. And in one of letters, recently, a year ago actually, before the war, but still almost a year ago, I found a phrase which shows his very, I would say, ordinary, nothing special, so ordinary as for that period of time, anti-Semitism. And I was really hurt. I was deeply hurt, because for me, Hanenko and his deeds and his letters and his memoirs and his speeches on the openings of the museums, he is telling about the importance of scholarship, the importance of museums, the humanistic ideals of museums, where I really, I was really fond of him, emotionally, personally. That hurt me a lot, and I just dropped my research of his biography for a certain period of time, because I really didn't know how to do it. I did not expect it. It was, it didn't fit my vision, my imagination. And I know the same issues found in the letters of Bode. And I saw that the Bode Museum starts actually the historical exhibition of the museum, and from this panel of Bode's anti-Semitism, dealing with it very well, I would say in quite an objective way. But for you personally, for you both actually, how do you deal with this issue? How do you think each should occupy this question, an important first place in his biography, in the research and publication, in the presentation and communicating of Bode and his role in the history of scholarship and the history of culture. How do you deal with this moment? I'm really interested.
Thank you. Should I start?
Yeah, please go.
Well, I must admit that in the period that I usually focus on in terms of Bode's activity, I don't really, you probably know better, I don't really see that much of his anti-Semitism, because he, he very closely cooperated with so many Jewish collectors, German Berlin German collectors, his letters tell. Pardon me.
Yes, it's a kind of contradiction. It's very strange. It's what is really strange to observe. But his letters, as I read, I haven't read the letters themselves. His letters telling about his anti-Semitic views on Bode, but I met a lot of references to that. Mm-hmm. It is there. And it's not some tiny moment, it's straightforward.
I must admit that I do admit my ignorance here, because I never really was interested in this side of Bode and his views in this realm. And I must say, I didn't really stumble across these kind of his opinions. So if they do, I don't know to what extent he is radical in these opinions, and what kind of views these are. I would probably now think that we have another example of this very pragmatic approach of Bode to, let's say, his business and how he does things and whom he works with, collaborates with, to achieve his goals or move forward the Berlin collections or the private, the landscape of private collectors, private collections in Berlin, because as you know, as you wrote, as a first person, he wrote predominantly with, at the beginning, Jewish collectors, German Jewish collectors, and although many of them may be assimilated, so in terms of not practicing anymore, but a Jewish background. So that would be probably another of these contradictions. I said, I don't know his his views and to what extent he was radical there, and of course this is very interesting, because this also going back to the question of how he distanced himself from the imperial court and let's say upper classes of the Kaiserreich, which were very often permeated by this very subtle, nuanced anti-Semitism. As we know, of course, many Jewish people of Jewish backgrounds were not really allowed to. Not really allowed. That was a sort of subtle, systemic intolerance, right? In the Kaiserreich, where individuals with Jewish background were not really, could not really help to make a career. That's why many of these industrialist collectors were not practicing anymore, right? So this is interesting in this perspective of Bode and nuancing himself from the general elites of the Kaiserreich, and they do not identify themselves fully with that. And then yet himself subscribing to anti-Semitism. As I said, I'm actually very curious now, and I will follow up on this because I don't know his views. So I don't know.
So James Zeno was of Jewish origin, and let us please remind that this was one of the biggest collectors who was collaborating with Bode, and he was then donating one of the biggest treasures in Berlin, Nefertiti. Yes, he was of Jewish origin, and I think that we could assume that whole group of those collectors, whether they were practicing or not, they were probably perceived as others, so to speak, as I was, for example, encountering this problem while research on Jewish art collectors in Warsaw. So this really was not the well, it's a huge topic. Thank you, Hannah, for raising this up. It's also somehow contributing to this demythologizing and critical perception of history in general. Excuse me, yes.
Well, thank you that you bring this up. It's a very important question. Let me just answer this with a personal remark. When I started re-editing the Mein Leben by Bode in the 2 volumes edition, one of the reasons to do that was that there was a 3rd part which was not published, and this 3rd part contained some very ugly remarks about the Jews, and that was the reason why it was not published before.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got this manuscript by the family, and I had many conversations with the family, and from the very beginning, my argument was we have to publish it, and there was opposition, and but I think we couldn't keep back some manuscripts, which were, by the way, also interesting in other ways, because of these parts, which were really not at all sympathetic. Now, I decided I wanted to publish it, and at the end, the family agreed. And then I had several conversations with also the museums, the Berlin museums, because in a certain way, there was shed new light on this great personality of the museums, and also of someone after whom a museum was called. So I had investigated thoroughly, I can tell you, this question with Bode for a long time. And I never changed completely my opinion, but I learned more about it, reading other authors, other witnesses of the time, and understanding much more how the period dealt with this problem. They were very negligent in a certain way. One has to say, in our view today, these were, I wanted to use a German phrase, these were unappetitliche Bemerkungen. But I use this description of unappetitlich, then I also allude to the fact that it is not easy to pull out of these remarks that Bode and others, there are others of course, was an anti-Semite. He was not. I mean, most of his friends, from Liebermann to others, were Jewish. He was surrounded. He didn't have a lot of friends, by the way. That's a very interesting point. But he was surrounded by Jews, and they were all his donors. He couldn't have completed what he did without his donor. That was absolutely impossible. And he was very close to them. I mean, let me just mention one of them on whom I'm right now working, and that was Werner Weisbach. And his father, Weisbach, was one of the important donors who was very underestimated. Valentin Weisbach was the person who helped. I dropped this passage because in response we couldn't be too long. So I dropped this passage in which I talked about the father of Werner Weisbach, Valentin Weisbach, who consulted Bode in financial questions. So he was very close to him, and he was during his whole since the beginning of the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, he was the one who ran the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein as a financial advisor, and so he was the Schatzmeister. He was a treasurer of the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, and his son Werner Weisbach, who became an art historian, a very important art historian, completely underestimated. I'm working on this person right now. Werner Weisbach knew Bode personally at its best because he went in and out of his house in the Tiergarten. And there's a long descriptions in the memoirs of Werner Weisbach about Bode and anti-Semitism. And he says, Bode was not an anti-Semite at all. However, he used whoever he could use, and also the idea of anti-Semitism. So he was in a certain way, I sometimes I don't like to say it in the camera. He was probably not a very sympathetic person. And if you read Friedlander and all different authors and collaborators, you will understand that he was a character who had an idea, and he wanted to have this idea about the museums realized. And he went over everything. So he was, in this sense, a rude person. However, he was definitely not an anti-Semite. It would have been impossible to get all these donors to help him. But one last phrase, he was not alone in behaving like that. It is one of the main problems of the society of the empire, of the German Empire, that especially the upper levels of society were speaking very loosely about truth and not respectful. And if you see this, and there are plenty of examples for that, you see on the other side people like James Simon and Weisbach and many others, the Mendelssohns, all these people who moved up in society and who tried to get accepted. And we have a term which I think is terrible, but which has been used all the time, and that's the term of Kaiserjude, which means they wanted to be accepted as important members of the society, but there was the other side which would never accept these contemporary, these citoyens, there were, of course, Germans.
Yes.
Not only Jews, they were Germans. So there is the conflict you are talking about. And Bode is one representative of this behavior, and there are plenty. He was not the only one. Yeah. But we have to deal with this in talking about Bode and bringing it in the right way. If we describe this personality, he was the most important director, museum director around 1900, and at the same time, he was part of his society.
Yes, well, it's a very important issue, and thank you for mentioning this. Also, I think this is one of important issue. This need for acceptation, and also kind of a tool for this acceptation is also art collecting for those Jewish who are.
Right.
And we are talking about briefing for various anti-Semitism. There was one important person, I think it was Rudy Hirschfeld, who in Poland was saying that he's not, let's say, not reluctant of open anti-Semitism. Of course, he was a Polish Jew. What we really disagree, or what he's really upset is coming across people who are saying, "Oh, you're a good guy, but you're a Jew." So those various, let's say, aspects of anti-Semitism. Still, it's unfortunately an anti-Semitic approach, especially seen from nowadays perspective. Yes? I wanted still to give you yes.
Maybe a brief comment on this topic of anti-Semitism, because I'm much more familiar to research on anti-Semitism than on art history. And I may just stress that Schiller Wolf, for example, characterized the Kaiserreich society, leading society, let me say, with a sort of anti-Semitism as a cultural code. And this has to be distinguished from other forms of anti-Semitism that we know from earlier and in the later times. So just mentions about Jews that are negative or so should be seen in the context of the societies and of the historical context too. Anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitism. There are many different forms of hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, social aspects and cultural aspects, and every one of them is not good for sure. But as a researcher, and I should try to distinguish, and then I can level this a little bit. And of course, one aspect, additional aspect that indicated Bode maybe that he was very pragmatical in many ways, and communicating with different addressees in different ways. So that's all.
Yeah, he looked for his advantages.
Yeah, I guess so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and because we extended this a bit our time stage, so thank you once again for this wonderful paper and for this interesting conversation. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for your question, especially to you, Hannah. Dr. Hannah Rudyk, who is currently here in Berlin at Technische Universität, will be also our speaker in September. So we are looking forward to hearing to your paper. And taking this opportunity, I would like to invite everyone to the third seminar, which is then on the 15th of June. And our guest will be Dr. Magdalena Wróblewska from the University of Warsaw, with her lecture entitled Colonial Entanglements. Again, we continue with entanglements. Colonial Entanglements of Central Eastern European Museums, the case study of African collection in the National Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank sincerely to my dear colleagues, to Professor Kokolewski, to Dr. Maciej Bukała for the meritoric support, and thank you for the technical support, or I would say taking care of me, as I'm absolutely hopeless when it comes to techniques. Thank you, Michał. Thank you, Michał Turski, Agnieszka Zawadzka, and Jolanta Szczerbin. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. And yes, and we look forward to seeing you again online or in person on the 15th of June on the third seminar. Thank you very much again for your attention. Have a nice evening.
Yeah,